The screen of my phone felt like a block of ice against my bare palm. I stared at the photograph my sister had just posted, and my breath plumed into white clouds in the middle of my own living room. In the picture, my mother was smiling over a plate of roasted duck at a five-star restaurant downtown. Behind her, a glossy banner displayed our company slogan, "No child should sleep cold." Then the harsh beep of a medical thermometer pulled my attention back to the hardwood floor. The house smelled like frozen metal and stagnant air. As a 34-year-old HVAC engineer, I knew exactly what a dead house smelled like. And this one had been dropping in temperature for hours. Outside, Milwaukee was locked in a brutal February freeze, and the cold had seeped through the walls of my old duplex. My 3-year-old daughter Ivy sat shivering on the couch. She was swallowed inside our neighbor's heavy wool coat, and her bare feet looked pale and mottled blue. "Is her temperature coming up?" I asked the paramedic. He nodded, packing his kit. "She is dehydrated and dealing with mild hypothermia. She needs to go to the hospital for observation, but she is stable." I looked toward the kitchen. The macaroni I had prepared before leaving for an emergency work call sat untouched on the counter. Beside it, Ivy's spill-proof cup remained sealed. June, my elderly neighbor, stood near the front door, rubbing her arms. "I heard her crying," June said, her voice shaking. I looked out my window and saw her little hands hitting the glass. The deadbolt was locked from the inside, Morgan. "It is too high for her to reach." My mother had locked her in. Carol had sent me a text at 3:15, promising to feed Ivy dinner and watch her until I got home. I pulled up my doorbell camera application. The file loaded slowly, but the timeline was clear. At 5:05, my mother walked out the front door, pulled her coat tight, and drove away. She did not come back. I walked past the kitchen to the utility closet. The metal door of the furnace cabinet lay wide open. Inside, the wires hung loose like severed veins. There were no scorch marks, and there were no signs of an electrical short. Someone had used a screwdriver to extract the control board. That board was the electronic brain of the entire heating system. Ivy leaned her head against the paramedic's shoulder. "Grandma took the warm box," she whispered. The words settled over me, heavier than the winter air. I followed the stretcher out to the ambulance, holding Ivy's small, cold hand. Once we were settled in the back, I pulled out my phone again. I needed to look at that photograph. The timestamp on Heather's post showed they had checked into the restaurant at 5:30. That gave my mother exactly 25 minutes to drive from my house in Bayview to downtown Milwaukee. It was a deliberate schedule. She had left my daughter to freeze, so she could network and pose for pictures before a corporate dinner. I opened my smart thermostat application to check the system logs. The furnace had not simply failed. It recorded exactly when it lost connection to the control board. 4:47. I did not leave a comment on Heather's picture. I took a screenshot and saved it. When we reached the emergency room, the bright fluorescent lights made everything feel too sharp. A nurse checked Ivy's vitals again, confirming she was hungry and cold but safe. I sat beside the hospital bed, pulling up the video June had taken of the open furnace cabinet before I arrived. A small piece of white paper was caught under one of the mounting screws. It was the torn corner of a QR serial label. Everwarm, the company my mother founded and where I held the operating license, used that exact model of control board for our city contracts. Furnaces did not lose their brains by accident, and my mother had been the only adult in the house when this one disappeared. The emergency room hallway smelled like bleach and stale coffee, a sharp contrast to the cold metal scent that still lingered in my nose from my living room. Ivy had finally fallen asleep in the pediatric wing, wrapped in heated blankets while an intravenous line slowly rehydrated her tiny body. I stepped into a quiet alcove near the nurse's station and looked at the time. It was 9:40. I dialed my mother's number. The call connected on the fourth ring. Clinking glassware and the low, polished hum of a private dining room leaked through the small speaker. "Tell her not to make a scene." Heather's voice filtered through the background, muffled but clear enough. "She is going to ruin the evening." "She is fine, Morgan," my mother said, her tone smooth and entirely unbothered. "Stop overreacting. Kids skip a meal all the time and the house cannot get cold that fast." I pressed the phone harder against my ear, letting the plastic edge dig into my skin. "You left at 5:05. The deadbolt was locked and the house was freezing." "Why did you leave?" A brief pause hung on the line, followed by a soft sigh meant to convey exhaustion. "I had to check the seating arrangements for the charity dinner. The city officials arrived early for networking, and we needed photographs before the main event started. Ivy always sleeps in the late afternoon anyway. I only meant to be gone a few hours, and you were supposed to be home before 10. The furnace lost its connection before you walked out the door, I said. She ignored the technical detail completely. I fed her before I left. The woman who raised me added, a practiced note of maternal confidence in her delivery. I thought of the untouched macaroni sitting on my counter, the sealed spill-proof cup, the timestamp of 5:30 on Heather's social media photograph, which proved my mother had driven straight from abandoning her granddaughter to a luxury dinner. No, you did not feed her, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. What did you tell the paramedics? My mother's voice sharpened, dropping the casual act instantly. That was the only detail that mattered to her. She did not care about the hypothermia or the locked door, but she cared deeply about the public record. I ended the call without answering. Leaning back against the cold hospital wall, I opened the company fleet application on my phone to check the vehicle logs. The screen loaded, but my administrative access to the location history was gone. My sister had downgraded my permissions weeks ago, restricting my view. I still had June's testimony, though. My neighbor had clearly seen an ever-warm van parked outside my duplex at 4:37. Someone had used my credentialed site to run an unauthorized job while my daughter was trapped inside. I needed to stop them before the morning arrived. At 10:05, I dialed the surety incident hotline connected to our city heating contracts. A representative named Dana Whitcomb answered the late-night queue. I kept my report strictly to the facts I could prove with physical evidence. A control board had been removed by a company van. My professional credential was being used without my approval, and a child had been put in physical danger. Dana explained the bureaucratic process quickly. This phone call would not result in police kicking down the restaurant doors. Instead, it triggered a legal preservation notice for all company communications and placed an immediate payment hold on any associated contract funds. An official audit would begin the following morning. I want you to stop my name from covering whatever they did tonight, I told the representative. After I hung up, a notification popped onto my screen. A new voicemail had arrived from my mother while I was speaking with the surety office. I pressed play, expecting another lecture about family loyalty and corporate reputation. Do not tell anyone about the board, her recorded voice ordered, clipped and precise. I stared at the glowing screen as the noise of the hospital corridor faded away. I had not mentioned the furnace parts during our brief conversation. My mother had not asked what was missing from the furnace. She already knew. The device on my hospital tray table vibrated against the hard plastic surface, buzzing like a trapped hornet. I watched the screen light up, go dark, and illuminate again in a relentless cycle. City contracting officers, warehouse managers, and extended family members all demanded my attention, filling my notification center with a chaotic stream of alerts. The red counter ticked upward steadily, finally stopping at 68 missed calls. In the narrow hospital bed beside me, Ivy shifted under a mound of heated blankets, her breathing evening out after hours of shallow, terrified gasps. I picked up the phone, silenced the ringer completely, and opened my voicemail application. The messages blurred together in a wave of manufactured panic and thinly veiled threats. An uncle left a rambling recording about how I was going to cost innocent people their holiday bonuses. The warehouse supervisor begged me to call him back before the morning shift started, his voice thick with anxiety. But one message cut through the noise, dropping the temperature in my chest by 10 degrees. Marcus Bell, our senior field supervisor, spoke in a hurried, breathless whisper. Do not delete anything, Morgan. They are changing the work orders right now. I did not hesitate. I exported the entire audio archive and sent it straight to Renee Park, the independent compliance attorney I kept on retainer to protect my engineering license. Dana Whitcomb from the surety office had been incredibly clear about what would happen next, and her explanation played on a loop in my exhausted mind. The emergency hold I had triggered would not shutter the entire company overnight, nor would it automatically cancel payroll for the technicians working out in the snow. Instead, it would simply freeze any unreleased municipal funds and block new permits from being pulled under my credential until a formal investigation concluded. The city took unauthorized equipment removal seriously. By making that single phone call, I had placed my own professional standing under a massive microscope. If the investigators found me complicit in whatever my family was doing, I would lose the career I had spent 10 years building. It was a terrifying risk, but watching my daughter shiver in a paramedic's arms had burned away any remaining hesitation. At 11:55, the screen illuminated with a motion alert from my home security system. I tapped the notification, holding my breath. The video feed buffered for a second before revealing my front porch, where snow fell steadily in the pale glow of the street lamp. Two familiar figures stood on my welcome mat. My mother and my sister had finally left their luxury dinner. But they had not brought a blanket, a change of clothes, or a single toy for the child currently recovering in the pediatric ward. "She is not answering," Heather said, her breath pluming in the freezing air as she pulled her designer coat tighter around her throat. The woman who raised me pressed the doorbell button again, her jaw set in a hard line. "She has to answer. We need her to call the surety back and tell them she approved the removal. Just tell her to say Ivy was with a sitter." The perfect daughter looked directly into the camera lens, her expression polished and completely calm. "Tell her to say the sitter stepped out for a few minutes. Nobody has to know the kid was alone in a cold house." I sat in the quiet hospital room and watched them barter with my daughter's safety. My thumb hovered over the microphone icon, but I did not press it. I stayed silent, letting the cloud server record every word, capturing the exact moment they tried to manufacture a legal cover story. By the time the sun rose, their narrative had already shifted. I scrolled through social media while Ivy ate a small plastic cup of applesauce. Heather had posted a lengthy, carefully worded statement on the company page, calling the incident a minor furnace malfunction and expressing deep sympathy for a family member operating under severe stress. Soon after, a cousin sent me a text message. My mother had been calling relatives since dawn, claiming I was trying to destroy the family business out of pure jealousy over my sister's recent promotion. I refused to post a photograph of Ivy in a hospital gown just to win a public argument. Instead, I took a screenshot of Heather's crafted sympathy post, saving it to my secure folder. It directly contradicted everything they had demanded on my porch at midnight. If the heating system had simply malfunctioned, there would be no logical reason for me to tell the city I had authorized a parts removal. We were discharged just before noon. The duplex was still freezing when we arrived, so I wrapped Ivy in a heavy quilt and sat her in front of a portable space heater in the kitchen. An independent municipal inspector arrived 30 minutes later, carrying a heavy flashlight and a metal clipboard. He walked straight past me, heading directly for the open cabinet in the utility closet. I stood quietly in the hallway, listening to the metallic scrape of his tools against the housing. "This did not break down on its own," the inspector muttered, shining his beam into the dark cavity. "Someone took a drill and a wrench to this unit. The board was extracted perfectly, which means whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." His technical report confirmed what my smart thermostat application had already told me. The heating system functioned flawlessly until exactly 4:47 yesterday afternoon. June walked over from the neighboring unit, handing the inspector a digital file from her garage camera. The grainy footage clearly showed a white Everwarm van parking in front of my duplex right before the heat died. Before sealing the cabinet, the inspector used a pair of tweezers to extract the torn scrap of paper I had noticed the night before. It was the bottom half of a QR serial label, left behind when the control board was unscrewed. He slid the fragment into a plastic evidence bag, sealing it with a thick red sticker. Once he left, I opened my doorbell application to review the afternoon footage. The video showed Luis, one of our junior technicians, walking up my front steps carrying a heavy canvas tool bag. When the clip finished, I received an urgent email from my sister containing a formal human resources notice. Heather had officially suspended Luis, labeling him a disgruntled employee who had gone rogue and stolen company property. I stared at the suspension notice, tracing the edge of my phone case with a trembling finger. If Luis had acted alone, then someone had gone to a great deal of trouble to make his theft look authorized. The Union Training Center smelled like burnt flux and old coffee. I sat at a scratched metal table in the break room, watching the snow pile up against the frosted window pane. The room was empty except for Luis. The junior technician sat across from me with his shoulders hunched, staring at the scarred table surface as if it held the answers to keeping his career intact. He looked terrified, and his hands trembled slightly as he pushed a mobile phone toward me. The glass screen was completely spiderwebbed with cracks, but the display still functioned. This broken device held the digital footprint my sister had tried to erase. Luis swallowed hard and finally looked up. He explained that Heather had sent the emergency work order directly to his device. When he arrived at my duplex, my mother opened the front door. According to Luis, Carol stood in the entryway and told him the property was completely vacant. She claimed I had already approved the parts removal and ordered him to work quickly. I heard something upstairs, Luis muttered, rubbing his jaw. A noise. It sounded like a kid crying. But your mother told me it was just the television left on in the bedroom. She said the homeowners were coming back to pack their things. My chest tightened, a cold and heavy pressure pressing against my ribs. My daughter had been crying out for help, and the adult in the room had dismissed her voice as background noise. I leaned forward and looked directly into his eyes. You heard her. You chose not to know. Luis flinched, dropping his gaze back to the table. He did not try to defend himself again. Instead, he detailed exactly what happened after he pulled the control board from my utility closet. He left my house at 4:55 in the afternoon. The drive from Bayview to the downtown restaurant garage was only 6 miles, but the winter weather slowed the traffic down. He arrived in the underground parking structure at 5:40. Heather did not even have to leave her luxury dinner for very long. The procurement director simply took the elevator down to the concrete garage, collected the cardboard box from Luis, and handed it directly to Marcus Bell. Our senior field supervisor had been waiting in another company van a few spots away. Luis never drove to another location, and he never saw where the equipment ended up. The geography of their crime was perfectly efficient, requiring minimal effort from the people orchestrating it. Later that afternoon, the quiet stillness of an executive law office offered a sharp contrast to the freezing Union Hall. I sat in a leather chair across from Renee Park, my compliance attorney. The smell of lemon wood polish hung in the warm air while Renee turned her laptop screen toward me. The surety preservation hold had successfully frozen our company's server, allowing the investigators to capture the raw audit logs before anyone could scrub them clean. We were looking at the version history of the work order that sent Luis to my home. The original text was plain and undeniable. It read, "Retrieve compatible control board from Morgan residence." It also included 2 specific system checkboxes that had been manually selected. The first box marked the house as a vacant property. The second box indicated that homeowner approval was on file. Both of those statements were deliberate fabrications. Sometime after the emergency hold went into effect, the record had been altered to read, "Emergency diagnostic requested by homeowner." Renee pointed a manicured finger at the bottom corner of the screen. The digital stamp proved that Heather's administrative account had both created the original order and attempted the late-night edit. Because the executive tablet was a shared device, we still needed to prove who was holding it at the time, but the timeline itself was beginning to lock them into a corner. The scope of their operation started expanding beyond my own living room. A preliminary audit of the municipal contract revealed a massive discrepancy in the supplier invoices. Everwarm claimed to have installed far more heating units than the company had actually purchased over the last 6 months. While old warehouse stock could technically explain a portion of that gap, the inspection records suggested something much worse. Dana Whitcomb had forwarded a secure file containing dozens of completion photographs from various city projects. As I scrolled through the images, a pattern emerged. The metal housing on one specific control board had a distinctive scratch across the serial label. I found that exact same scratch in 3 different photographs, taken in 3 different basements over a span of 4 weeks. They were not buying new equipment for the city contracts. They were moving a small handful of functioning parts from house to house, just to pass the municipal inspections, leaving vulnerable families with broken systems the moment the cameras left. The serial numbers were the only objective truth left in this entire mess. I looked back at the timestamp on the original work order Heather had created. The system clocked the entry at 4:12 in the afternoon. I pulled up my own text messages and stared at the confirmation my mother had sent me at 3:15. Carol had explicitly agreed to watch Ivy and feed her dinner. My sister had logged into the system a full hour after my mother took over babysitting duties. Heather knew exactly who was inside that duplex. The order had not overlooked my daughter. It had erased her before Luis ever reached the door. The drive to the Riverwest neighborhood took 20 minutes through streets packed with gray slush. I followed Dana Whitcomb and the municipal inspector to a small single-story house sitting near the end of a quiet block. Elena Alvarez waited for us on her front porch, wrapped tightly in 3 layers of knitted sweaters. Her breath formed thick clouds in the freezing air, and she kept her hands shoved deep into her pockets. When we reached the steps, The homeowner pulled a glossy promotional brochure from her coat and handed it to Dana. I looked over the surety agent's shoulder to read the heavy print. The pamphlet displayed a professional photograph of my mother and my sister, both smiling brightly as they handed a wrapped blanket to a local family. Our company logo sat right above the familiar slogan, "No child should sleep cold." "The heat only worked for one afternoon," Elena said, her voice shaking from the chill. "Your people came out, installed the unit, took their pictures for the city website, and left. The next morning, the vents went completely dead." We followed her inside and walked down the creaking wooden stairs into the unfinished basement. The space smelled like damp earth and cold concrete. The inspector clicked on his heavy flashlight, aiming the bright beam directly at the open furnace cabinet. A rusted, dust-covered control board sat inside the metal housing. It clearly did not match the pristine equipment listed on the official city invoice we had reviewed that morning. Dana pulled up a digital completion photograph from her tablet, holding the screen next to the rusted machinery. The picture showed a brand new board installed in this exact cabinet. I leaned closer to the screen, studying the details in the high-resolution image. A jagged white line cut across the black square of the serial label in the photograph. It perfectly matched the torn piece of sticker the inspector had pulled from my own furnace the day before. The equipment had moved, and the digital footprint left behind revealed exactly when it happened. The completion photo carried a verified timestamp of 7:19 in the evening. That was over 2 hours after Carol had locked the deadbolt and driven away from my duplex. My daughter had been sitting alone in the dark, shivering in her thin pajamas, while someone snapped a promotional picture of her stolen heating equipment across town. We had the serial match, but the navigation data from the company vehicles finally connected the physical route. The GPS tracker on Marcus Bell's assigned van painted a precise map of that evening. The data logs showed his vehicle leaving the downtown restaurant garage at 5:45. He drove straight to River West, navigating the winter traffic and arriving at the showcase house 15 minutes later. Marcus had already provided a recorded statement to the investigators, hoping to salvage his own employment record. Our senior field supervisor admitted the company kept a rotating list of inspection boards. He confirmed my sister sent him the target address while she was sitting at her dinner table, and he noted that my mother pushed everyone to finish the swap before the morning inspections began. Elena was not the only person paying the price for that fraudulent business model. The surety audit had flagged dozens of suspicious addresses across Milwaukee, and we spent the rest of the afternoon visiting 3 more homes on the critical list. At the first stop, a young mother had plugged a dangerous space heater into a frayed extension cord. Her infant slept in a portable crib nearby, while her official invoice claimed she had a brand new heating system. The second house belonged to an elderly man wrapped in heavy moving blankets. His basement contained a refurbished board that actually belonged to a completely different zip code. I stood in the freezing dirt of a third basement, watching the inspector document another mismatched serial number. The smell of burning dust from overworked space heaters lingered in my clothes. The weight of my family's legacy pressed down on my shoulders, heavy and suffocating. I had spent 10 years earning my engineering credentials to keep people safe, and my own relatives were using my name to freeze them. I pulled out my phone, called the emergency dispatch team, and formally transferred every vulnerable address to a temporary municipal contractor. I was sitting in my parked car outside the third house when my screen lit up with an incoming call. The display showed my sister's name. I answered the call and put the device on speaker, letting the audio record directly to my secure cloud backup. Heather spoke in a low, conspiratorial whisper, completely abandoning the public outrage she had posted on social media that morning. She offered to help me build a legal case against our mother, provided I protected her procurement position from the incoming auditors. She wanted to form an alliance, treating the entire disaster like a simple corporate chess match. I stayed quiet, letting the silence stretch out inside the cold cabin of my car. My sister grew anxious to fill the dead air. Her breathing hitched, and she rushed her next sentence. "I thought Ivy would be asleep until you got home," she blurted out, her voice pitching up in a desperate attempt to sound sympathetic. My fingers tightened around the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I had never told anyone about Ivy's afternoon sleep schedule. I had never mentioned that my mother promised to stay until I finished my shift. My sister did not just know the house was occupied. She knew exactly who was inside, and she had planned the equipment theft around a 3-year-old child's nap time. Heather realized her mistake instantly. She ended the call abruptly, leaving only the flat dial tone echoing in the car. 5 minutes later, a carefully scripted voicemail arrived, full of legal disclaimers and polite requests for preservation records. But the damage was already done. Heather had not asked whether Ivy was home. She had just admitted she already knew. The screen mounted in the corner of the law office waiting room played the local morning broadcast on a continuous silent loop. My sister stood behind a cluster of microphones, wearing a tailored navy coat that looked pristine against the falling snow. Her 2 children flanked her, positioned perfectly beneath the corporate logo. The news anchor spoke with practiced gravity, summarizing Heather's public statement. The procurement director had officially labeled the incident a minor furnace malfunction. She then called me a traumatized mother reacting out of severe emotional distress. Renee Park walked into the room and handed me a cup of black coffee. The warm paper burned my freezing fingers in a good way. The compliance attorney told me I could not use a photograph of my daughter in a hospital gown to win a public relations war. We had to stick to the timeline verified by the preservation order. I took a slow sip of the bitter drink, watching my sister project the image of a perfect, deeply concerned sibling to the entire city. An hour later, the company warehouse smelled like diesel exhaust and damp cardboard. Tension hung thick in the freezing air as I walked past the loading bays. 24 technicians stood near the unlit permit desk, their faces drawn tight with worry. A veteran installer stepped forward, crossing his heavy arms over a grease-stained jacket. He blamed me directly for the payment freeze, terrified that his paycheck would vanish right before his rent was due. Another worker nervously rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the floor and admitted that management had repeatedly asked him to swap serial labels on old equipment just to pass city inspections. I looked at the anxious crowd, promising to protect their wage records. I would not, however, promise to save the empire my mother had built on their labor. The cost of exposing the truth meant innocent people were caught in the crossfire, and that weight settled heavily in my stomach. By early afternoon, the path forward became clear in a secure conference room. Dana Whitcomb sat across from a municipal contracting officer, sliding a thick binder over the mahogany table. The city official explained the emergency continuity clause written into every municipal heating contract. If the primary vendor defaulted, the city could legally transfer critical residential addresses to a temporary administrator or a different contractor. The surety bond would finance a limited portion of the completion work, though it would not salvage every single job. A third option formed in my mind as I studied the paperwork. I could formally pull my engineering credential from Everwarm entirely, completely stripping them of their ability to pull new permits. At the same time, I could hand the city a verified list of critical homes and a roster of qualified, honest workers to finish the winter installations. Before I could finalize the decision, Dana turned on the digital projector. The investigators had subpoenaed the security footage from the valet station outside the luxury restaurant. The grainy video jumped to life on the white wall. A timestamp in the lower corner read 5:40 in the evening. Luis drove the white company van to the curb, rolled down the window, and handed a cardboard box to my sister. Heather stood under the glowing awning of the restaurant, checked the label on the side of the box, and calmly walked it over to Marcus Bell in a second waiting van. She never left the dinner event for more than 10 minutes. The physical exchange was damning, but the text messages extracted from the cloud server revealed something much worse. Dana clicked to the next slide, displaying a raw message thread between my mother and my sister from the previous afternoon. Carol had typed a short update, stating that Ivy was playing upstairs. Heather immediately replied that Luis had enough time to extract the control board before anyone noticed. The woman who raised me sent a follow-up text, warning that her granddaughter had not eaten dinner yet. The procurement director typed her final response without hesitation. She told our mother that the 3-year-old could simply eat when I finally got home, because the morning inspection absolutely could not fail. The image of the perfect family shattered against the wall of the conference room. They had bartered my daughter's safety for a municipal approval signature. That night, a video conference call connected me directly to my mother. She sat in her home office, illuminated by the harsh light of a computer monitor. Heather sat beside her, looking deeply uncomfortable. Carol leaned into the camera and offered me the majority ownership of the entire company. It was the very first time she had ever called me worthy of leading the family business. She promised to step down and hand me the empire, but her generosity carried a massive condition. I had to tell the investigators that the parts removal was authorized and that Ivy was safely watched by a babysitter. Heather immediately protested the offer, her voice shrill as she realized she was being pushed out of the executive line. The woman who raised me ignored her golden child completely, keeping her eyes locked on my face. She was not trying to make peace, she was trying to purchase a legal alibi using the one thing I had always craved as a child. She believed my desire for her approval would outweigh the memory of my daughter shivering on a cold wooden floor. Renee tapped her pen against the desk, breaking the tense silence in the room. The attorney reminded me that the emergency transfer plan required a signature before the municipal offices opened the next day. By sunrise, I had to choose between the license that carried my name and the company that carried everyone else's paycheck. Dawn broke over the city in a bruised purple line, casting long shadows across the icy pavement outside the law office. I sat across from Renee Park, staring at the ownership transfer documents my mother had sent over during the night. The thick stack of paper smelled like fresh printer ink and desperation. The contract promised me everything I had ever asked for as a child: equity, operational control, and the executive title. All I had to do was lie to the municipal investigators and tell them I authorized a stranger to dismantle my heating system. No, I told the attorney, pushing the documents across the polished mahogany table. I do not want the equity. Draft the formal withdrawal. Renee nodded slowly, her pen moving with practiced precision across her yellow legal pad. I officially revoked Everwarm's right to pull any new permits under my engineering license. At the exact same time, I handed the compliance officer a verified roster of qualified technicians and a detailed list of critical residential addresses that required immediate heating repairs. The city would assign a temporary municipal contractor to manage the emergency transition. I surrendered my entire financial stake in the family business, making sure no one could accuse me of manipulating the crisis for my own profit. I picked up my mobile phone and opened a blank message to my mother. "You wanted my name. You do not get to keep it." I hit send, placing the device face down on the desk. The physical fallout hit the company warehouse right before noon. I stood near the dispatch office, watching the brutal reality of my decision unfold in real time. A temporary administrator from the city walked through the freezing concrete bays, handing out new assignments to the honest mechanics on my roster. Some men secured temporary jobs with the new contractor, looking relieved as they grabbed their heavy tool bags. Others were sent home with severely reduced shifts. A few simply packed their equipment and walked out into the snow, their faces tight with anger. Luis stood by his metal locker, emptying his gear into a faded duffel bag. The junior technician had accepted a formal disciplinary process from the city board. He was not a hero for handing over the broken phone, and the investigators treated his gross negligence with the severity it deserved. He zipped his bag shut, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the floor as he walked past me. I could not save everyone, and the bitter weight of that truth settled deep in my chest. An hour later, the heavy steel doors of the loading dock rattled loudly. My mother marched into the facility, her designer winter boots clicking sharply against the bare concrete. She bypassed the security desk completely, swiping her executive keycard at the main office door. A red light flashed on the electronic scanner. The temporary receiver had already locked her out of the system. Carol turned around, her face flushed with genuine shock as she rattled the locked handle. Her phone was already pressed to her ear by the time my own device began vibrating in my pocket. I answered the call, watching her glare at me from across the busy warehouse floor. She called me a traitor to my own blood. She listed every sacrifice she had ever made to build the company, her voice echoing thinly through the small speaker. I did not argue with her. I simply stood quietly and watched a municipal maintenance worker unscrew the heavy brass Everwarm nameplate from the wall above the permit desk. By late afternoon, the unified front my family had built began to crack under the mounting legal pressure. I sat in a municipal observation room with Renee, listening to the audio feeds from two separate interview rooms down the hall. The investigators had separated my mother and my sister, placing them in identical gray spaces. In room A, Carol pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the recording device. She claimed Heather controlled the entire procurement schedule and executed the equipment theft completely independently. In room B, the procurement director wept softly, insisting she only created the fraudulent work orders because our mother terrified her with threats of failed city inspections. They did not just point fingers, they brought receipts. Heather slid a thick blue supplier folder across her table, documenting exactly how Carol ordered the refurbished parts and hid the invoices. 10 minutes later, my mother retaliated. She handed her investigator a printed stack of emails, proving Heather had personally edited the metadata on the completion photographs. When forced to save themselves, the two women perfectly corroborated the guilt of the other. The final blow came from the cracked phone Luis had surrendered at the Union Hall. The digital forensics team managed to extract a deleted cloud backup, recovering two distinct voicemails. The first audio file played through the observation room speakers, recorded right before the incident at my duplex. Carol's voice rang out, sharp and impatient. She explicitly stated that I had left the house, Ivy was playing upstairs, and Luis needed to take the control board and bring it straight to Heather. The second voicemail arrived hours later, ordering the technician to delete his work history and claim I had called him directly. The young man had finally confessed his entire part, admitting he heard my daughter crying but chose to follow the recorded orders instead. The family that had survived by sharing lies was beginning to collapse because neither woman was willing to share the blame. The morning sunlight slanted through the Venetian blinds of the municipal hearing room, casting long, dusty stripes across the wooden conference table. I sat beside Renee Park, watching the digital forensics investigator connect a sleek laptop to the large wall monitor. The atmosphere in the room felt heavy with anticipation. The investigators had spent the last 24 hours analyzing the digital signatures attached to the municipal completion certificates, and the trail of data pointed directly to my professional credentials. For the past week, both Carol and Heather had used my name as a shield. My mother insisted that I must have designed the entire fraudulent scheme, since I was the only engineer on staff with the technical expertise to understand the control boards. My sister claimed I willingly handed over my electronic signature asset and permitted her to use the office equipment whenever necessary. Without concrete digital evidence, I looked like the architect of a citywide safety violation. The investigator tapped a few keys on his keyboard, pulling up a specific completion certificate that had been processed during the crisis. The date and timestamp on the document read 9:38 in the evening. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I remembered that exact minute with terrifying clarity. At 9:38 on the night of the incident, I was standing inside the brightly lit pediatric emergency ward, holding my daughter's cold hand while nurses monitored her rising body temperature. Renee placed a calming hand over my clenched fist, urging me to stay silent and let the data speak. The investigator zoomed in on the metadata embedded within the digital file. He explained that a document of that complexity could not be signed from a standard cellular phone using a mobile application. It required a registered network session and a dedicated device identifier. The server logs confirmed that the signature was executed using our executive tablet, a heavy touchscreen device that rarely left the corporate office. My sister had claimed she was miles away at the luxury downtown restaurant during the entire evening, but the restaurant guest Wi-Fi logs told a completely different story. The executive tablet had connected to the private dining room network at 5:32 in the afternoon and remained active on that exact router until nearly 10 o'clock at night. The device never once appeared on the main office network during the entire evening. The investigator clicked to the next file, pulling up a high-resolution security still captured from the private dining room's corner camera. The timestamp matched the completion certificate down to the exact second. In the photograph, Heather sat comfortably at the polished mahogany table, holding the executive tablet in her hands. Leaning closely over her shoulder, Carol pointed a manicured finger at a printed document, reading out a residential address so her golden child could type it into the system and authorize the fraudulent paperwork. They were approving the theft of public safety equipment, while my 3-year-old daughter was being treated for hypothermia a few miles away. 2 minutes after that photograph was captured, my phone records proved I dialed my mother's number from the hospital. The audio recording of that brief phone call came back to haunt them. In the background of the call, Heather's voice was clearly audible, complaining loudly that I was going to ruin the evening and demanding I stop making a scene. Further forensic analysis revealed the mechanics of the digital forgery. Heather's administrative account had accessed a stored image of my handwritten signature, which had been scanned months prior during a standard company compliance training session. She dragged and dropped that image onto the completion certificates, using the executive tablet while sitting at a 5-star dining table. Hospital Wi-Fi logs, phone location data, and my bedside medical records confirmed beyond any shadow of a doubt that I never accessed the company network that night. The licensing board members exchanged grim glances as the complete picture emerged. I was officially cleared of any direct participation in the document forgery. However, the board chairman pointedly reminded me that as the licensed engineer of record, leaving my digital signature asset accessible on a shared executive device constituted a serious administrative oversight. I would still face a mandatory compliance review and months of strict operational supervision, but the threat of immediate criminal exposure was lifted from my shoulders. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a long, shuddering breath I felt like I had been holding for days. The signature that had nearly destroyed my career was mine, but the hands that used it were sitting beneath a glossy banner proclaiming that no child should sleep cold. The spring snow had finally melted away, leaving the muddy streets of Milwaukee exposed to the pale April sunlight. I sat in the packed gallery of the municipal hearing room, watching the digital clock on the back wall tick toward 10 in the morning. This was not a criminal sentencing. It was the formal city debarment and licensing review, designed to determine whether Everwarm would retain its municipal contracts or be permanently stripped of its right to operate. 4 months had passed since the night my daughter was rescued from a freezing duplex. Ivy had fully recovered from her mild hypothermia and the lingering chest coughs, though she still asked me every now and then why our old heating box had been taken away. I kept her safely away from the media spotlight, refusing to let her face become a public talking point. The hearing examiner called the room to order, rapping a wooden gavel against the podium. I took a slow, deep breath, stood up from my wooden bench, and walked toward the center aisle to present our evidence. I did not rely on emotional speeches or dramatic accusations. I let the verified timeline speak for itself, keeping my voice steady and completely objective. I traced the sequence of events step by step. I presented the independent technical report, showing the smart thermostat going offline at 4:47. I displayed June's doorbell footage, capturing the company van arriving at my home. I showed the original work order created from Heather's account that falsely marked my residence as a vacant property. Dana Whitcomb stepped up next, laying out the financial evidence with clinical precision. She presented the supplier invoices, the mismatched serial numbers recovered from the municipal audits, and the GPS tracking data that mapped Marcus Bell's van directly to Elena's showcase house. When Elena took the stand, she described how her basement heating system worked only long enough for the promotional photographs to be snapped before failing entirely. The wall of independent witnesses and physical records completely dismantled any illusion of an innocent mistake. Luis stepped forward to play the recorded voicemails my mother had left him on the night of the incident, followed by the midnight security footage of Carol and Heather standing on my porch, trying to force me to lie to the surety investigators. The medical records from the pediatric emergency room were entered into the record, destroying my mother's persistent claim that my daughter was never in actual physical danger. When the city panel opened the floor for defense statements, my family's unified front finally shattered into complete chaos. My mother stood up first, her posture stiff and defiant. She argued that every single decision she made was driven by an absolute necessity to keep the company solvent and protect the livelihoods of the vulnerable families who depended on our work. She claimed she was the true victim of a ruthless corporate coup engineered by ungrateful subordinates. Before she could sit down, Heather interrupted her loudly from the defense table. My sister jumped to her feet, her voice trembling with sudden rage as she pointed an accusing finger at our mother. She shouted that Carol was the one who gave the direct order to abandon the duplex, reminding everyone that our mother knew the house was occupied and intentionally ordered the equipment extraction to avoid a failed municipal inspection. Carol turned on her golden child with absolute fury, screaming that Heather was the one who managed the procurement schedules, created the fake work orders, and forged my digital signature on the executive tablet. The examiner leaned forward, tapping a button on his console to override their shouting match. The large wall monitor flickered, shifting away from the legal documents to display a high-resolution photograph. It was the promotional image Heather had posted on social media during the charity dinner. My sister stood smiling brightly in a luxury restaurant, holding a wrapped blanket with her children standing close beside her, all framed perfectly beneath the company banner that read, "No child should sleep cold." The digital metadata proved that photograph had been captured at the exact same time my daughter was locked inside a freezing home with a dismantled furnace. The image that had been manufactured to build a public empire of warmth became the ultimate piece of evidence proving their cruelty. Carol stared up at the monitor, her face draining of all color, as she whispered that everything she did was meant to save the company. I stood near the podium, looking down at the two women who had built a lifetime of conditional affection. I kept my voice completely level, refusing to raise my tone. "You saved a contract by leaving a child in the cold," I told them. "That is what your company was." The municipal panel adjourned immediately to review the final file. The city had heard more than enough evidence to strip away their corporate power forever. What remained was for the criminal courts to decide the final price of their ambitions. The final gavel strike of the Municipal Debarment Board marked the permanent end of Everwarm Heating. Within weeks, the corporation was placed into court-supervised receivership. The surety bond, combined with the liquidation of remaining company assets, was used to fund the completion of residential heating repairs across the city and cover a portion of the financial restitution owed to defrauded families. The substandard equipment that had been shuttled from basement to basement was systematically pulled out and replaced with compliant systems. The criminal proceedings moved forward steadily over the following months, driven by the massive wall of physical evidence, financial records, and digital logs. When the overwhelming stack of voicemails, text threads, and witness testimonies was presented to the defense, both women realized a trial would only ensure a harsher sentence. They each opted for plea agreements. My mother received a sentence of 5 years of actual prison time, heavily weighted by the court due to her role as the primary mastermind and her direct responsibility for child endangerment. The judgment included strict asset forfeiture, stripping away the properties and wealth she had accumulated through decades of systemic fraud. She was permanently barred from holding any public contracts, and the court issued a strict protective order forbidding her from contacting Ivy without my explicit written approval and judicial oversight. Even during her final sentencing hearing, she maintained that her actions were necessary to preserve the business. The judge did not offer her any leniency for an apology she never felt. Heather fared little better, though her cooperation came slightly earlier after she realized our mother had tried to push all the criminal liability entirely onto her shoulders. She received a sentence of 2 years of actual prison time, followed by extended probation and mandatory financial restitution. Her executive management credentials were permanently revoked, and she was banned from ever managing a public contract business again. All of her polished social media profiles, charity sponsorships, and promotional materials were scrubbed clean by platform administrators. The father of her children filed for an immediate modification of custody while she served her time, ensuring her kids were protected from the fallout and shielded from public humiliation. My own professional life required intensive rebuilding. The licensing board formally cleared me of any direct involvement in the document fraud or the equipment swaps. However, because I had permitted the company to retain my electronic signature asset on a shared executive device without sufficient security controls, they mandated a formal compliance training program and 6 months of strict operational oversight. I walked away from the receivership proceedings with zero equity in Everwarm, refusing to accept a single cent of the liquidated assets beyond my final earned wages. Some of the honest technicians who had suffered through the payment freeze chose to join a new venture I helped establish, named Common Hearth Mechanical. We built the company from the ground up under a transparent external compliance review framework, incorporating a public serial registry so no customer would ever have to guess whether their heating equipment was legitimate. Luis completed his municipal disciplinary process, accepting a lower-tier position under heavy supervision. He was not a hero, but he was willing to work honestly for his wages, and the court allowed him a chance to earn back his professional standing. By the time the next winter arrived, the biting cold of Wisconsin felt entirely different. I drove out to the River West neighborhood on a freezing afternoon to check on Elena Alvarez. Common Hearth Mechanical had completed the installation of a brand new, fully certified heating unit in her basement months prior. I walked up the snowy front steps carrying a large thermos of homemade chicken soup and knocked lightly on the door. Elena pulled the door open, greeting me with a warm, genuine smile that reached her tired eyes. We stepped inside the cozy living room, where the floor vents hummed softly, pumping steady waves of heat throughout the small house. Ivy stood right beside me, bundled up in a thick wool coat, carefully holding out a paper bag filled with fresh bread rolls. "Everything is working perfectly," Elena said, gently patting my daughter's winter hat. "The house has never been this warm." She briefly mentioned that a local community newspaper had called, asking if they could send a photographer out to do a positive human interest story on how we repaired the neighborhood's fraudulent heating systems. I smiled politely, shaking my head. "No thank you," I said. "We prefer to keep things quiet." As we drove back home through the twilight, the street lamps flickered on one by one against the deepening blue sky. In the back seat, Ivy looked out the frosty window at the passing houses, her breath catching softly in the cold air. "Mom," she asked quietly, her small voice cutting through the hum of the engine, "is Grandma cold where she is?" I glanced up at the rearview mirror, meeting my daughter's clear eyes. I knew Carol was safe inside a climate-controlled facility, wrapped in standard institutional blankets. But she would never again have the power to measure her own warmth by deciding who else had to freeze. "She is safe, sweetie," I answered, keeping my hands steady on the steering wheel. "And nobody is ever going to leave us out in the cold again." For the first time in my life, warmth entered a house without anyone in my family needing credit for it. You spent your entire life believing that love had to be earned through perfection, that your worth was only measured by how well you could carry a family name while others took the credit. You learned the hard way that true warmth never comes from a public mask, and that a grand title means nothing if the people holding it are willing to leave a child alone in the freezing dark. You did not break their empire with a miraculous weapon or an impossible stroke of luck. You simply stopped letting your professional name cover up their lies, and you let the cold, hard facts speak for themselves. The lesson left behind in the snow is painfully clear. Family is not a license to exploit, and protection does not look like a polished promotional poster designed to hide neglect. Real safety is built brick by brick with accountability, transparency, and the courage to say that enough is enough, even when the person holding the knife is someone you once called home. You rebuilt your life on a foundation where a house could finally be warm without anyone needing a headline or a corporate slogan to prove it. How many times have you stayed silent to keep the peace, carrying a weight that was never yours to bear, just to protect someone else's illusion of perfection?